Okay, we're moving on to the patient assessment sections. So this is going to be a number of chapters kind of all grouped together that we're going to go through here in 1 week. It is probably the most important part of this book because if you can't assess a patient, then you're going to have a hard time treating the patient. It's a very systematic approach as we go through this. Basically, when you go to a call, your patient assessment process is going to be the same. It doesn't matter what the call is. The actual process is going to be the same. You're just going to input different information in there, and then from there your treatment will vary based on what the medical condition is, if it's trauma, if it's medical, kind of what direction things are going. But from an actual assessment standpoint, very systematic. Just get into a very good routine. Like I said, probably the most important section of this entire book is going to be this assessment section. We're going to cover scene size up, the primary assessment, which is going to be your initial assessment, and then vital signs and monitoring devices. That is a big hands-on one. It can be tough to learn. It's new experience. Taking blood pressures, listening to lung sounds is extremely challenging. But we'll try to give you all the tools possible to help get better at it. Really, the biggest thing that you can do is the more you do something, the better you're going to get at it. So the more that you practice blood pressures, the more that you check a pulse, the more that you listen to lung sounds, the easier they all get. So any chance that you can, take advantage of it so that you can improve on what you're doing. And then we'll go into the principles of the assessment, the secondary assessment, how reassessment works as you go on through the call, and then the last section, which is in the next unit, is actually communication and documentation. We do that one separately because it's also very important on its own. So we want to just specify some time for that. But we'll dive right in. This first chapter is going to be scene size up. It's not a real long chapter, and it is pretty common sense when you look at it. But like I said, it'll all make sense as we go through. It's very systematic. So as we start with the scene size up here, the important thing to remember is the survey of that scene starts before you even get there. It's going to begin with the dispatch. Hopefully they give you some detailed information as to what you're walking into. Probably the biggest piece of information that you need to know is if that scene is secure or not. Never enter an unsecure scene. Always wait for PD to secure it. It doesn't matter really what that patient's condition is on the other side of the scene. They could be dying, and ultimately you have to put yourself first above anybody, and don't enter that scene until it's secured, because you don't want to walk into some sort of domestic dispute, and then all of a sudden you're standing there with somebody that has a knife pulled on you. A, you can't take care of the patient, and B, now you might have put yourself in a situation where you're going to be that patient too. So it's going to begin with the dispatch. It's going to continue as you approach the scene. It continues throughout the patient assessment and care, and then you kind of adjust and make changes on the fly with things. So we're going to learn about the observations to make and actions to take when identifying those scene hazards. We're going to determine the nature of the call. We're going to decide whether to seek additional help or not. Understand that sometimes you might be the only responding crew. A lot of times you're not, though. You'll have police there, you'll have fire there. You may, if it's a car accident scene, you may need other resources too. You may need a tow truck there to help stabilize the vehicle in those types of situations. So we'll run through this, and hopefully you can catch on to it fairly quick. So the actual elements of the scene size up here. So checking for scene safety. Hopefully you'll know before you get there to a certain degree if that scene is safe based on what the dispatchers are telling you. But ultimately when you pull up to that scene, kind of pull up slow, give it a good look around everything, make sure that everything seems to be secure. Understand that things change, so when you get there, things could alter on you very rapidly, and then you may have to anything from adjust what you're doing right then and there to you may have to completely back out if the scene becomes extremely dangerous. It's best to get out of the situation, put yourself in a safe place so that you can get back in there and take care of it when it's secure again. Next thing, take those standard precautions, right? Ear protection comes first. Gloves, mask, especially nowadays with COVID, safety goggles, whatever you need to do to protect yourself. Note the mechanism of injury or the nature of the patient's illness. So mechanism of injury is going to be trauma related. Nature of the patient's illness is going to be more of a medical standpoint. So you're going to go up to the scene. If it's a car accident, you're looking for things like how much damage is to the vehicle, how many vehicles are there, was the seatbelt on the patient, did the airbags go off, is the windshield shattered. Any little clue that you can get that might indicate what the patient's condition could be, whether they're complaining of something or not. Use those tools to kind of determine what you think might be going on. If the windshield is starred and the patient seems to be acting fine, says that he feels fine, understand that something starred that. So it could have been the airbag, it could have been something else in the vehicle, but it very well could have been the patient starred it, and for whatever reason, their condition is okay right now, but that doesn't mean that it can't change rapidly. They could have a serious brain injury and then in a matter of a few seconds go from being perfectly fine to being completely unconscious. So you have to use all of those tools and indicators to help basically form an impression as to what's going on. You need to determine the number of patients. You're a single ambulance. Maximum case that you could probably transport is 2, but that all is contingent on kind of the condition of the patient. So if you have 2 critical patients that are unconscious, you should never take both of them in the same ambulance because you need to be focused on taking care of that patient. And if you have 2 critical patients, it's going to be hard to divide and conquer in those situations. Plus, depending on what equipment you have, you probably only have equipment for 1 patient. So like if you're an advanced level provider, you're going to have 1 cardiac monitor. So how do you monitor both patients' cardiac rhythm when you only have 1 piece of equipment? So you have to kind of put all of those into perspective too, to understand what other resources do you need. Do you need a helicopter? Do you need 1 more ambulance? Do you need 5 more ambulances? And you need to make these decisions early and fast so that you can get them coming. You also have to kind of fall back to really early on in the textbook when we talked about some of the legal issues and abandonment. If you have a critical patient and you have 2 other patients that are also hurt, if you just take the critical patient and leave and there's no other EMS resources there, and one of those other patients dies, you could be held responsible because you abandoned that patient. So there was nobody there to provide care. So it's a tough situation, but you have to take all those factors, put them into place. And then, like I said, decide what additional resources you may need. It may be more than just ambulances. Sometimes you might be in a district where the fire department doesn't respond. I know like Silvis, the fire department didn't respond to calls unless they were requested when it came to EMS or even really car accidents, sometimes if they were minor. But you may get there and figure out, hey, I need the door pop to get this patient out, so you need a fire department. Maybe there's tons of traffic and police aren't there. You need police there to help contain the traffic. Maybe it's wintertime and the roads are icy and it's not a safe situation for you because every time that you go to get out of the vehicle, there's a car swerving around. So maybe you need to get like the Department of Transportation out there to slow down traffic or to salt the roads or whatever the case may be. It could be the helicopter to help, get a patient to a more definitive place faster than what you can get them there in the ambulance. So the biggest thing is understanding what resources you have at your disposal and when you're going to use them. Understand the only predictable thing about emergencies is that they are often unpredictable and can pose many dangers. So understand that you may walk into something that seems to be very straightforward. This is going to be routine, and things can change really fast. It doesn't matter if it's a medical call, doesn't matter if it's a psychiatric call, doesn't matter if it's a car accident. Things can change. You have to be observant. You have to be prepared to step back, to alter what you're doing. Whatever the case may be, everything is always a very fluid situation. So just prepare yourself. Be alert to indications um, that may be around you. Things like power outages, things like placards on a vehicle. If it's say it's a tanker truck, understand what those placards mean, and understand that, hey, all of a sudden something's leaking out of here. You need to kind of have an idea of, okay, how significant is this? Know how to use the book to understand what those placards are as well. Look for things like broken utility poles, downed wires. And then another thing is always be cognizant of onlookers. Don't let them get in the way. Um, it's not really your job to police them, but if the situation arises, make sure you have the resources to take care of those onlookers, because it can also make for a challenging scene depending on the situation. So you can't reiterate it enough. Just be prepared for things to change rapidly, and be prepared to move yourself out of a situation if it becomes unsafe or unpredictable for you. Now, talking about collision scenes, um, as you get there, understand you're not going to be the only responding unit more than likely. So as you approach, look and listen for other emergency units. The worst thing that could happen is you're coming from one direction, another emergency vehicle is coming from another direction, and you both kind of blow through an intersection or something and you collide. Now you've just amplified the situation, because now you have a couple units that aren't able to get to the scene that need to. But now you've also created another accident scene that police have to take care of, fire department has to take care of, perhaps EMS has to take care of. So now you've kind of exponentially made the problem worse. Look for signs of collision-related power outages. So as you approach the scene, again, just kind of be visual of what's going on. Understand that, hey, all of a sudden these street lights are out. So when you get there, it makes you more cognizant of things like, is there a power line down? Never approach a down power line. Never go near a vehicle that has a down power line on it. Make sure that you utilize all the resources you can. That might be one of those situations where you have to get the power company there before you can even get the patient out. Again, it's very, very challenging. It can be very disheartening when you have to watch a patient maybe suffer, perhaps die. But understand that putting yourself in there with them isn't going to do any good. All it's going to do is probably cause harm for you. So you have to put your safety first. Observe the traffic flow. Believe it or not, there are proper and improper ways to park when you get to a scene. If you're not the first unit on scene, always look for direction from whoever's there. Usually you'll have some sort of incident commander on the scene that will say, ambulance, whatever, you're going to pull in right behind the engine. You want to do things like turn your wheels so that they point into the ditch and away from the flow of traffic. So that way if a vehicle comes and rear ends you, they're going to push your vehicle down into the ditch and not into more traffic, creating more patients, creating a bigger issue. From an EMS standpoint, we try to teach people always to give yourself a blocker. So you want to park someplace where you have a fire engine, a police car, something directly behind you, kind of protecting you. So that way when you're climbing in and out of the back of the ambulance, or you're loading your patient in and out of the back of the ambulance, you do have some sort of protection. So understand that traffic flow, where you need to go, how you need to park. Every situation's different. Common sense really goes a long way with this. look for things like smoke in the direction of the collision scene. If it's a big tanker truck that's on fire, it could create a hazmat situation. You don't want to drive through the smoke to get there because then you've just contaminated yourself. So understand that when you're looking for these indicators, it may alter things like your course of path of getting to the scene. So you may have to turn short, go a couple blocks around, and come in from the other side. Hopefully, the dispatchers will forewarn you that it could be a hazardous situation. Hopefully, they'll tell you kind of what direction you should come in from, or hopefully there's some sort of incident command on scene. If you see that smoke or you see something that indicates that it could be a hazardous scene, you want to make sure to park. If you're the first one there, you want to make sure to park well far enough away that you are protected until somebody gives you that clearance to go into the scene. I can't emphasize it enough. Your safety has to come first as an EMS provider. Okay, now you're approaching that scene. You can kind of see it. And so now these are a few of the things that you need to look for. So you need to look for that hazardous material, whether it's a fluid running across the roadway, whether it's smoke billowing out, and also understand that there could be hazardous materials that you can't see as well. So just be cognizant of that. Look for victims on or near the road, or as you're approaching, maybe a victim's walking down the road. So maybe they didn't think anybody called for help, and you might be 2 blocks and see somebody bleeding. Don't dismiss it. Understand that, hey, maybe that's somebody walking to get help. That stuff does happen. Understand that, victims can be thrown out of vehicles, victims can be hit by other vehicles. There's just a multitude of situations that can occur. So be cognizant of it, especially when it's dark, especially when you have low visibility in snow or rain or whatever the case may be. I've never seen it. I've never actually even heard of it, but I can't imagine there would be a worse feeling than maybe the patient was alive and an emergency responding vehicle either hit them again or ran them over, not knowing that they were laying in the road. So as you get closer to the scene, slow down and really look and listen to what's going on. We talked about that smoke from a distance, and if you see it, stay back until you get cleared to go in. But now as you approach the scene and you have everything in sight, look for that smoke that you can't see from a distance, that maybe there's a small fire under the engine compartment, and you don't want to be climbing in the vehicle because all of a sudden if that fire takes off and starts raging out of control, you may not be able to get out, and you could eventually perish in that type of situation. So you just have to be very cognizant of everything through the entire process. They keep reiterating this: broken utility poles, down wires. I have had a number of calls with down wires. I have had calls where there was a downed wire and a little girl grabbed it, not thinking, walking down the street. She electrocuted herself. So always assume that any wire that you see that's down on the ground is live until you're told otherwise. Don't assume, well, that's a cable TV wire. You don't know. It's not our profession. You want to err on the side of caution. You want to err on the side that's going to protect you the most. Last couple things here as you're getting within that site. Again, just watch for those people walking down the road, and not only patients walking away from the scene, but bystanders walking to the scene. Everything that you're watching for your own safety, you need to take that into consideration with bystanders that might be playing the Superman card thinking they're going to come and help. You want to prevent them from walking into anything that could cause more patients, could cause issues for them. So you do have a certain standard that you have to protect them as well. And then as you're getting there, watch for signals from police and other emergency service personnel. If you're not the first one on scene, hopefully somebody is going to take command of that scene and kind of lay out how everything should go, where people should park. That first person there needs to think about things like, okay, I got to get the ambulance in here, I got to protect the ambulance, but I also have to give them a route out so that when they get their patient loaded, we haven't trap them into the scene. So if you're the first one there, those are things you have to keep in mind. If you're not the first one there, hopefully somebody else has thought about that, and watch for them to tell you, hey, you're going to park here, or hey, we want you to go up there. Whatever the case may be, just follow the direction, and then you can alter your course once you get there. And then again here, follow the instructions of that person in charge. If you are the first one there, you're going to be that person in charge until somebody that comes has a higher rank or better fits that role, and then hand over the information just like you would hand over patient care. You're going to hand over the information. Hey, this is what we have. This is what we've taken care of. Now you're in charge of the scene. I'm going to go take care of patients. Ultimately, your responsibility is going to be to take care of the patients. More than likely, it's not going to be to manage the scene. So as soon as you can hand off that part of it, get back to what your role is, taking care of patients. Make sure to don the appropriate protective apparel. So if you're going into a vehicle, make sure you have some sort of protective clothing on, whether it's bunker gear. Make sure you put a helmet on, safety glasses. If they're cutting that car out around you, and this is an entirely possible situation where you may go in, start taking care of the patient, be in there to kind of talk them through as things go. They may cover you and the patient up with blankets and whatever else to help protect you, but then they're going to start cutting the car out, removing things so that they can get that patient out from around you. So you have to protect yourself. The other thing is, whenever you're on a roadway, wear an ANSI approved reflective vest. So these are going to be, anytime you drive through a work zone and you see everybody's wearing that fluorescent green, fluorescent orange, there are specifications to that safety equipment. A lot of EMS coats now have those specifications built right in, but if they don't, make sure that you put that vest on. You have to be able to protect yourself in these situations. And then continue to be cognizant through the entire call. So if something changes, if there starts to be smoke, if you start to smell an odor, whatever the situation is, understand that it could indicate some sort of hazardous material, hazardous situation for you. Better for you to back out of the situation, or depending on the status of your patient, maybe it goes from when we talked about lifting and moving and the whole emergency versus kind of non-urgent moves. Maybe it goes from a non-urgent move where you're kind of taking your time to get the patient out. You want to not have more injury, so you're cutting the car out around them, to all of a sudden something changes drastically. Hey, we need to get them out of here now. Life or limb, it doesn't matter. Grab them by the arms, however you can get them out, pull them out, get them away from that situation. So it's just one of those things you have to be cognizant as the scene moves forward, and as time progresses through the call. Next thing here is establishing that danger zone. So think of this as like your personal bubble. And everybody has that personal bubble that they don't want somebody up in their face having a conversation with them. Kind of the same concept here. Create that danger zone around the scenes, and it's going to depend on what's kind of going on at the scene. So every wreck of every vehicle collision should have this danger zone where you're more cognizant. You kind of follow the rules of what you're told by fire personnel, police, whatever the situation may be. So if it's a standard car accident, no real apparent hazard, no down lines, nothing leaking, just a very routine car accident, you want to be 50 feet in all directions is kind of what that danger zone is. Now, if you do notice fuel, something is leaking, you want to extend that to 100 feet in all directions. So basically you want to keep your ambulance outside of that danger zone, so you have a quick retreat point. So depending on that situation, again, going back to like parking on the scene, it may dictate, all right, you're going to park here because it's routine versus I need you a little bit further away because there's fuel leaking or whatever the case may be. If there is something leaking, always try to park upwind if possible, which 99% of the time you should be able to. Stay away from the low-lying areas. Stay away from ditches. Stay away from anything that may have that fluid running towards your vehicle. You want to steer clear of that from a safety standpoint at all times. So now if a vehicle's on fire, it's at least 100 feet in all directions. There's going to be some variables to this. Obviously, a big semi-tanker truck on fire is completely different than your standard two-door passenger vehicle. It's also different with an electric vehicle too. So just understand what is on fire. Always err on the side of caution. Better to be a little bit too far away than a little bit too close in case something bad were to happen. If wires are down, you want to be one full span of wires away from the pole to which the broken wire is attached. So basically, if there are two poles broken, the next pole's intact, you want to be one more pole past that in case something were to pull that first intact pole is weakened or whatever the case may be. You want to be far enough away that you're still protected in the instance that that would fail. Now, if hazardous materials are involved, when I talked earlier about the book, it's actually called the Emergency Response Guidebook. Every emergency vehicle should have an up-to-date one in it. I do believe that's actually required by law. But it is going to tell you everything that you need to know. So if you see a placard number, you look up that number. It's going to tell you what the material is. It's going to tell you the safe distance. It's going to tell you if there's an exposure, what your treatment plan is for it. It's going to give you every piece of information for really every type of hazardous material that could be involved. So get familiar with that ERG book. Understand how to read it so that you can kind of pull it out at a quick reference in those types of situations. All right, let's talk a little bit about crime scenes, those domestic type calls where there's active violence or whatever the situation may be. Don't put yourself in harm's way. Make sure that you have law enforcement there to protect you. Be cognizant of fighting or loud voices. Be aware if you're taking care of the patient and they say that the assailant left, be prepared for them to potentially come back. Maybe it starts as a physical altercation, where they punch each other some. The person takes off. You're there taking care of the patient, but what you don't understand is that that person took off because they were at their wits' end and they went to get the gun out of their car to come back and finish the process. Now all of a sudden you're in a situation where you don't want to be there. So just be wary. Don't put yourself in that situation without the proper protection and law enforcement. Be cognizant of weapons that are visible or in use. Perhaps you see a knife on the table as you're taking care of the patient. You get the police department to secure that. If you have an unconscious patient and you find a weapon on them, kind of stop, take a step back, let the police department secure that. You don't want your patient to come to not knowing that you're there helping them and all of a sudden reach down and grab it, and that could be the end for you. Look for signs of alcohol and or drug use. These are for a couple reasons. One is your protection, to understand that these people could become violent. Another reason to be on the lookout for that is to help you treat your patient. If you have an unconscious patient and you see a syringe laying on the floor fairly close to them, now you need to be thinking, could this be an overdose, or what is the situation? So it can give you, more than just an indicator of it being a crime scene or an act of violence. Again, make sure the police department are aware of it. Let them secure it. Let them take it in for evidence, whatever the case may be. Be cognizant of that unusual silence. So kind of like the scary movies, nothing good comes after that awkward silence. It can be the same in the EMS setting. Just always be on your toes and be ready. And then, honestly, a good one, because you'll pick up patients repeatedly through your career. It doesn't matter where you are, you're going to have those people that call all the time. If you've been there once for violence, you can have violence there again, whether it's a straightforward medical call the next time or not. You always need to be on your toes and be prepared for violence to occur, especially in those situations where you've dealt with it before or the police have dealt with it before. Just use a lot of common sense when it comes to that. All right, so now kind of to think about it, when you're thinking about these potential safety hazards, what type of calls do you think can pose the highest threats of potential violence or, an unseen safe for you? Coming from somebody that's been on thousands and thousands and thousands of EMS runs, I've seen a lot, and I guarantee I haven't seen it all. So you always have to be prepared. You have to always put your safety first. They put these standard precautions here in the middle. I would honestly have probably put it at the beginning, um, just because it's the first thing that you have to do before you get there. Um, you should have your gloves on before you even get to the scene. That way you're not fumbling over them when you get into the patient or whatever the situation may be. So gloves, mask, eye protection, any of the personal protective equipment, whether it's bunkers, helmet, better gloves than just your regular rubber gloves that you wear to take care of a patient. Um, it comes down to protecting you first. So standard precautions, absolute must. Any scenario that we do, any of the national standard scenarios, always start with scene safe, BSI. Um, that should be the first two things automatically out of your mouth in any situation, because otherwise that's an automatic fail from an education standpoint. Um, it's just one of those things. It should be completely second nature for you. Get in the rig, put your gloves on, start preparing mentally for that call. As you get closer to the scene, determine what other personal protective equipment that you may need. So now the nature of the call, um, and that is where you determine why you've been called. So again, mechanism of injury is going to indicate some sort of trauma. Nature of illness is generally going to indicate some sort of medical. Can the two coexist? Absolutely. What if somebody has a heart attack and then wrecks their car? You may have a medical call and a trauma call going on at the same time. What if somebody has, uh, it's called a syncopal episode, but it's when you pass out and they fall down and smoke their head on the table. Now you have a medical call that caused a trauma call. So they do coexist. You need to understand what those mechanism of injuries, nature of illness is. It's going to kind of help you clue into what equipment you need, what safety standards you need to react to. Do you need mask, face shield, gloves, um, all that personal protective equipment? You can kind of determine based on some of this. And then as you get there and you've determined this, it's going to help create that course of treatment plan that you're going to have for your patient moving forward. All right, specifically for mechanism of injury, let's understand first the forces that may have caused the injury. So um, there are so many different variables, it's hard to talk about them all, but 15-mile-an-hour car accident versus a 65-mile-an-hour car accident, it has different force that can cause those injuries. So common sense would tell you the faster the vehicle is moving, the more force that is going to be exerted on the patient, the higher the probability of injury. So it's important to understand kind of how that plays a part in your assessment process. Understanding those forces can help you predict injury patterns as well. If I fall off a roof and I land on my feet, that's going to be a completely different injury pattern than if I fall off that roof and land on my head. So understanding what those forces are, understanding the different dynamics of it can help you predict what possible injuries there could be, especially when it comes to like motor vehicle accidents. Did they have their seatbelt on? Were they thrown around the inside of the vehicle? Did they have their seatbelt on to where, um, maybe it was them just back and forth, and you're looking at more of a neck injury versus a blunt trauma injury. So use every possible little indicator you can through the scene to help you identify and kind of predict. Like I said, not all patients present with the injuries that they actually have. Adrenaline takes over in those situations, so sometimes people may seem to be perfectly fine and they're not. You have to be able to assess that vehicle and kind of predetermine, well, these are the things I should be looking for, and then you put a little bit more focus on the assessment of those specific areas so that you can completely verify that, yeah, it's okay, or no, hey, look, we did find something that maybe the patient didn't present with. So here's a picture of just a standard car accident. Looks like probably a rollover accident based on the way the roof is buckled and the windshield is shattered. But you want to look at the exterior damage to see if you can suspect certain types of injuries. Now with that, kind of take it with a grain of salt, because with the safety standards in today's vehicles, you are going to see in your career some horrific looking accidents that people are actually perfectly fine from. Today's standards, they're so high that a lot of times those cars are built so that they give away every place except where the patient is. So you kind of have to use that exterior damage to predict some injuries and assess, but understand it doesn't always mean if it's a horrific looking vehicle that they're necessarily going to be hurt real bad. And the vice versa with that is true too. Um, Sometimes you may have a vehicle that doesn't look bad and your patient's hurt really bad. Um, Maybe it's some freak thing, maybe they weren't wearing their seatbelt, whatever the situation is. It all boils down to assess your patient and use everything else as tools to help in your assessment process. All right, now motor vehicle collisions. And this first slide here talks about head-on collisions. So generally, if you have a head-on collision, there's going to be two types of injury patterns. One is the up and over, one is the down and under. So think of this like if you're the driver and you get in a car accident, are you going up and over the steering wheel, or are you going down and under the steering wheel? And basically what you're looking at with this is if you're going up and over, you're probably looking at head injuries, upper body injuries, chest injuries from maybe hitting the steering wheel. If you go down and under, usually it's when that patient kind of slides underneath of the steering wheel, and you're looking at more lower extremity injuries. You're looking at broken legs, broken femurs, broken pelvises, maybe some abdominal injuries. Um, Not to say that it is 100%, but generally speaking, these are what these injury patterns will show you with it. So if you get there and you find the patient's kind of um, pushed underneath of the steering wheel, you kind of know what to look for initially in your assessment. And then you kind of grow the assessment from there and move on with your treatment patterns based on some of what you find. A little more with the head on here. Um, look for airbags. Hopefully the airbags went off. Hopefully the airbags did their job. However, airbags, if the patient is not properly seat belted, if they're too close to the steering wheel, there's a number of factors. They can cause their own injuries too. So understand and be prepared for that. Um, Looking at this image, it's got a shattered windshield. Based on how you kind of look at that, the assumption that I would make is that when that airbag exploded and that dash rolled up into the windshield. You can see where that shatter line is, right where the dash hit, and then everything kind of spidered from there, probably from when the airbags went and put pressure on the windshield, because those airbags are going to come out towards you, but they're going to go up and kind of give a layer of protection all the way around. So they'll cause some outward damage to the vehicle as well as protecting inwardly to the patient. Usually, if you see a starring from where a patient struck it, it's usually going to be a smaller circle, a tighter pattern in the shatter, that you can understand that's probably where something on the patient hit the windshield. And then that kind of alters your assessment process from there. But you have to use all of these tools, all of these indicators to help determine what potential injuries you could be looking at with the patient. And this one does kind of show you what I just talked about there with, you can kind of see how in the center of that spider web, it's really tight, like something really hit it square on right in the middle and then kind of pushed it out, and then the spider webbing kind of got further and further and further apart, away from the central impact point. This is the type of shattering that would indicate to me, maybe the head struck the windshield and then spidered out from there. Not to say that that's necessarily the case. More times than not, this is more indicates the type of windshield shatter that you would see from somebody hitting it, not just an airbag where it's going to be kind of widespread over the whole windshield. And then we do have other type of motor vehicle accidents here that we'll talk about. Rear end collisions, you're going to suspect more of the head and neck injuries, because they're going to get pushed forward and then snap back real hard. That these are the type of injuries you usually have the whiplash and really just those kind of injuries. Not to say that there can't be more depending on the situation. Those are things that you need to be cognitive of. Side impact collisions, which is, you'll think of them as a broadside or a T-bone, where one vehicle is driving one direction, the other vehicle is driving perpendicular to it, and it gets struck in the side of the vehicle. Depending on, if it's one person driving the vehicle that is broadsided, is the vehicle struck on the passenger side or is the vehicle struck on the driver's side? Because it's going to indicate completely different injury patterns. Also understand that there are low impact collisions that can cause death or serious injury, and side impact collisions is one of those. For whatever reason, there's something in the body structure that there's been a number of cases where patients have actually tore their aorta on a side impact that was a very low speed side impact. It's just something with the way the body is built. So it's something that you have to keep in mind, and be prepared for. Rollover collisions, it's kind of the wild card because there's so many variables to it. Did the airbags go off? They can provide some protection, but not always in a rollover collision. Did the rollover occur with the vehicle rolling over its side, or did the collision occur with the vehicle rolling over end? Did the vehicle roll over one time? Did the vehicle roll over 4 times? There are so many variables with the rollover collisions. You just have to be really cognizant of all types of injury patterns when it comes to rollovers. Quick image here of a rear end collision. And my assumption, based on not being on this scene but looking at the vehicle, is they got struck really hard from the rear, and then they got pushed into a vehicle in front of them at a slower rate of speed. It's either that or they rear-ended somebody that they got really slowed down mostly for, and then they got really hit hard in the rear end of the vehicle. I'd be more apt to say it was the first one though. Otherwise, even if they were pushed up tight against the vehicle in front of them and then got hit that hard from behind, there should be more damage to the front end too. Now, if you're looking at this, the things you're looking for is intrusion into the passenger compartment. So is it just a driver in this vehicle? Because based on the front door, it looks like the driver's compartment stayed pretty well intact. I would suspect head and neck injuries in this type of situation, um, and maybe some other minor injuries. Now, if the patient is in the back seat, that's completely different when you're looking at intrusion into the vehicle. Um, there isn't much left of the back seat of that car. Um, like we talked about earlier, the front held up with today's safety standards like it's supposed to. If there was a patient in the back, completely different situation, completely different injury patterns that you're looking for. So as you're assessing the vehicle and assessing your patient, you also have to put into play where they were at and where the damage occurred. All right, side impact. Um, this is probably a really bad day for that driver. Um, I I don't see much good coming out for this driver. I can almost guarantee you that there is very significant injuries with that driver, if not death, for that driver. If you look at the intrusion, I'm guessing that to be 18 inches, maybe 24 inches, and sometime go out and grab a tape measure and measure how far it is from your door to the center console. I guarantee you that car is pushed at least halfway to the center console, which would indicate very, very serious injuries for the patient. Um, to get that patient out in itself is going to be a chore. You're definitely going to need to use your other resources, have the fire department there. It also looks like there is some leaking fluid underneath of the vehicle to be expected in that situation. So again, something to be cognizant of. But you're probably going to have to extricate that patient from the other side of the vehicle, take the top off the vehicle. Um, this one would be a very tricky situation. On a side note, if you go back to the medical legal section, there's no picture of a patient. There's no picture of the license plate. However, if you snap this picture and you shared this picture out, um, you would be in violation of HIPAA. Um, you can read the fire department's name on the side of the vehicle, so that can tell you where the accident occurred. And then with the building in the background, you can narrow it down to what the accident was, and therefore you could be held to a HIPAA violation if you were inappropriately sharing a photo like this out. Now, from an educational standpoint, it's okay, we can do these things. If you're taking the picture and with an appropriate device and you're attaching it to the chart, again, also appropriate. If you're using it to show the physician when you get to the ER, also appropriate. You just have to understand kind of what your rules and regulations are when it comes to that. Rollover accident. Obviously a small passenger car. Um, and as you look at these pictures, kind of think about everything that we've talked about um, up to this point. So first thing that you would see is there's snow all over the ground. That would indicate slippery conditions, which means your safety, um, you kind of have to put that a little bit more into perspective when you're parking your ambulance, um, to make sure you're protected from other vehicles that might lose control. It is very common when a car loses control on ice, you're going to have multiple cars lose control in the same spot, um, just because of the dynamics of what's going on the roadway in that situation. You can also see, like we talked about, they have the ambulance parked in front, and then they have some sort of um, probably like a fire chief's vehicle kind of parked behind it and to the side. And then a little bit further back from that is a fire apparatus that is lined up with the ambulance, offering it some protection. Um, so kind of use these images to give you a little bit of perspective on everything you're learning to this point.
As you look at this actual car accident, do you see any damage to the driver's side? Because I don't really see any damage to the driver's door, the back door, the tires, the rear tail light. This indicates to me that this was just kind of a Tommy tip over where the vehicle rolled over 1/2 revolution onto its roof. Um, when it lost control, it's not very far off of the roadway, which would indicate to me it was probably a lower rate of speed. Honestly, in this situation, unless the patient wasn't wearing a seatbelt or unless there was some sort of uh, freak thing that happened, I wouldn't suspect this patient to have very serious injuries, looking at the injury patterns based on what my experience is. There's also what's called rotational impact collisions. So this is where the car is spinning. Usually when that car is spinning, um, it causes other impacts, which could cause subsequent injuries. So imagine a multi-vehicle accident, car gets rear-ended, kind of spins it, another car comes and hits it in the front end, spins the vehicle back around again, and then that vehicle strikes another car that's parked there. Um, so there are a whole lot of different impacts that occur. So you could be looking at injury patterns from head-ons to rear ends to just about really anything in these type of situations. They're less common. Your more common accidents are either your single vehicle or two vehicle accidents, but you do need to be aware that this can happen. Um, the other thing to be aware with is perhaps the first impact wasn't bad and the patient took their seatbelt off thinking that they were going to get out, and then another car comes up and strikes the scene. Now they've had an impact without their seatbelt on, um, which could create a whole different injury pattern. Basically, it rolls back to um, use your tools, use your common sense when you're looking at the vehicle to try to determine what injuries you may see within that patient. Onward to falls. This is I don't want to say it's an unusual one because common sense goes a long way with this. Um, Basically, falls of more than 20 feet with an adult um, indicate very high risk. Children under the age of 15, um, it's more than 10 feet. Really, the better way to measure any fall, regardless, is 2 to 3 times the height of the patient. Obviously, if I'm on an 8-foot garage roof and I fall off, depending on what I'm landing on, it's not a tremendous fall. Now, if I have a 2-year-old up there and that 2-year-old falls off, proportionally, it's a significant larger fall. Um, so, really, the contingency here is how tall is your patient and how far did they fall. Um, the other things to keep in mind with this are what did they fall onto? Um, if they fell into a pile of snow, that's going to be a lot different than falling onto a chunk of concrete. Um, and then the other thing that you have to keep in mind with falls is what part went first. Head first, feet first, back first, chest first is going to indicate different injury patterns for that patient. Sometimes it's hard to judge that because by the time you get there, they're on the ground. If nobody witnessed it, you're not going to know how they fell. But use your resources, talk to people, try to get information that you can um, to kind of help narrow down in your assessment process what you're looking for. So as you look at this gentleman on the ground, um, looking around, assessing the scene, you'll notice it's a construction scene. You'll also notice things like they're putting up fresh walls on the second story and the first floor is already built. Um, so you could make an assumption that he maybe fell from the second story, or maybe they're putting the roof on and he fell from even higher than that. But if it's unwitnessed, you may not know. I mean, maybe this guy had a heart attack and dropped over. He didn't fall at all. Um, but the assumption that you're going to make is always on the side of more caution. So when in doubt, assume they fell. Take all the preventative measures as if they fell, because you're not going to cause more harm. However, if you assume they didn't fall and they did, you could cause more harm by not taking those preventative measures, by not using cervical spine stabilization, whatever the case may be. So this is just an image to kind of make you think a little bit about if you walked in on this scene, what would your initial thoughts be? A little bit redundant here because I've talked about this, but again, height of the fall, what they fall onto, what part hit the surface first, if you know. And then the other thing I didn't talk about, is there anything that interrupted the fall? Did they fall through tree limbs off of a roof to the ground? Did they fall through a bush onto the ground? Did they fall from a 2-story roof but landed on a 1-story roof and then fell from the 1-story roof? Anything that can slow that fall down is going to hopefully prevent some injuries from occurring. But again, it all comes down to your assessment, knowledge of the scene. You really want to take good notes so that you can pass on all of that information to the hospital when you transport the patient. All right, to some other types of trauma, other mechanism of injury here. First one being penetrating trauma. So this is when something passes through the skin, enters into the body tissue, enters into maybe the organs, and may eventually pass all the way through, exiting out the opposite side. It's something that you have to look for. So basically, these are going to be classified by the velocity of the item that caused the injury. Next slide, we'll talk about that a little bit. And then, based on the velocity, the type of injury, where the injury is located, hopefully, as you go through the assessment process, you're going to be able to determine the injury patterns, what different organ systems maybe were included, so that you can kind of predict, hey, this hit a crucial spot where I need to expect massive blood loss, or this, hit a spot where I need to expect some breathing failure because the bullet went through the lung. So based on where that occurs, the velocity of the item that went through will hopefully help you in your assessment and treatment process with the patient. So we'll have the low velocity, the medium velocity, and the high velocity. The low velocity injuries, example would be knife injuries. Damage is going to be limited to what the projectile can get to. So these are the type of situations where you need to know what impaled the patient, the length of it, the width of it, the size of it, things like that, because if it's a 1-inch knife blade, like a utility knife, that's going to be different than a 6-inch hunting knife entering into the body. So it really just depends. Hopefully you'll have that information. If you don't, and there is a penetrating injury, assume that it's deeper than what you may think, and then err on the side of caution when it comes to the treatment. Any of these type of trauma situations are going to be, let's get them loaded, let's get them to the hospital, because you don't have x-ray vision, so you need to get them someplace that they can, get a better, proper assessment on what might be going on inside the body. Also be aware of multiple wounds with it occurring in different regions of the body, so that you can treat it appropriately when it comes to that. Again, back to the scene safety. If the projectile is still there, or the person holding the projectile is still there, your scene safety has to come first. So never enter the situation unless it's secured. And if the situation escalates to where it's not secure anymore, back out until it does get secured. So medium velocity is going to be handgun. A lot of these are going to be projectiles that probably enter the body, but don't really have an exit point. They're lower velocity, they're still going to cause significant damage based on where they strike. You're looking for damage directly from the projectile in this situation. And then high velocity is going to be like the rifle injury, something that there's enough velocity that it could pass all the way through. Not saying that it has to pass all the way through. It's more likely that it's going to pass all the way through. So again, you're looking for damage that's being directly caused from the projectile. You're looking for pressure-related damage because as that passes through at a higher velocity, it's going to put a lot of pressure on everything around it as it goes through the body. So it can cause more damage. You're looking for that cavitation where, think about when, I'm sure you've seen movies where the bullet enters on one side, it's a small hole, it exits on the other side, it's a large hole. That's common in the high velocity injuries. You also have to be aware that there could be rebound damage inside of the body to where if, say, a bullet enters the body, doesn't have enough velocity to get all the way through. I've seen this in gunshot wounds to the head, where that bullet will kind of bounce around inside the skull. Doesn't have enough velocity to exit the skull, but it's got enough velocity that it's going to bounce off back and forth inside a little bit. So it can create more damage depending on where it is. Obviously, if it's a gunshot wound to the head, more than likely it's going to kill the patient. But if it's someplace else in the body, it can cause a lot of damage on the inside. All right, blunt force trauma is injuries from a blow that strikes the body that doesn't penetrate the skin or other body tissues. Think of a boxer. Every time they get hit, it is blunt force trauma occurring on them. Now they're trained to take it, so obviously I don't know why they would be trained to take it, because to me it just, from an EMS standpoint, when you look at a boxer, you're thinking it's really the dumbest profession on earth, but it is what it is. So those blows that strike the body that don't penetrate the skin. Blunt force trauma is very common in car accidents, very common in falls. Really, most of your trauma you have is going to be blunt force trauma. Signs are really easy to overlook. They can be subtle. A lot of times blunt force trauma to the chest or abdomen, it's hard to assess. It's easily missed in things like lacerated livers, lacerated spleens, punctured lungs. Always err on the side of caution. I always encourage patients to go to the hospital to get evaluated because we don't have that x-ray vision. They need to go have a picture taken on the inside to make sure that everything's okay. So always maintain that high index of suspicion based on the mechanism of injury. Again, going back to our medical legal, patient wants to refuse, all you can do is educate them, try to talk them into it. If they're conscious, alert, and oriented ×4, it's well within their right. Really, the important thing for you to know is how to understand all of this trauma and what it can do to the body so that you can properly talk to the patient and explain to them what could be going on. On to nature of illness here. Think of nature of illness as the reason that you're called. So mechanism of injury is going to give you all those tools and indicators as to what might be going on. Nature of the illness is why you were called. To identify this, it starts during the scene size up. You need to take a look at the entire scene, kind of see what's going on. More importantly, you need to listen to the patient, talk to people around the patient, so that you can determine what that nature is, so that you can determine what your course of action is when it comes to treatment. Another quick image here, and again, just kind of put your brain to work. You roll up on this scene as a medical provider, and you see a patient sitting there. What are some of the things you notice here? Well, there's a bicycle. Now, do you see any damage to the bicycle? I don't see any damage to the bicycle, so if it was a bicycle accident, probably not a serious one. Is it a medical condition? That's going to be hard to tell until you get out and start talking to the patient, find out what's going on, start talking to bystanders, and find out what's going on. Just actively look for your patient, for any additional patients, for any indications as to what might be going on. You can't judge temperature, but it's a sunny day, they're wearing short sleeves. Um, Maybe this guy's out biking and he got overheated. Um, you just have to put all those variables into perspective as you're approaching the scene to help determine, again, what that course of action is going to be moving forward. Okay, now to get that information, first and foremost, try to get it out of your patient. Um, and try to get it out of your patient early. Conditions change fast. Um, if your patient can talk when you get there, get as much information out of them as you can. Because if the situation changes to where they aren't able to talk to you and you didn't get pertinent information out of them, you may never know. Ask questions early, get as many answers as you can. If for whatever reason you can't get information out of the patient, maybe they're unconscious, maybe they're not capable of giving you information, maybe they're confused, then utilize family members or bystanders. Um, See what information they can give you. Um, Kids are a tough one because your first instinct is to always go to the family member to see what's going on with the kid. I find that treat the kid like a person. Like, I don't care if they're 6 years old, they can answer questions. Um, Ask them the questions and don't let adults or parents steer the answers for them, basically. Um, put a lot of stock in what your kids have to say because you will have those calls where the parents, for whatever reason, maybe it's a child abuse situation, they're feeding the answers for their kids. Part of the proper assessment is you acquiring all the information that you can. When all else fails, use the clues that you can get from the scene. Um, Whether it's a car accident, whether it's whatever the situation. Um, Look around, see what clues you can get from the scene that may indicate. Um, if it's a medical call in a patient residence, look for their meds. Look for a common place is on the refrigerator, especially in the older population. They'll have a file for life card or something similar that might indicate all their medical conditions. Go back and look for things like those medic alert bracelets. Any clue that may give you um, intel into what that nature of illness might be is going to be useful. And then the final talking point here is number of patients, adequacy of resources. So when you're looking at that scene size up, how many patients are present? Do you have enough resources? And try to anticipate prior to getting there. If you get called for a one vehicle accident, you could probably make an assumption that you can start with one ambulance. If you get called to a two vehicle accident, that sounds like it's a significant accident. I would think you could make the assumption there's got to be at least two patients, unless it's a new Tesla that they're testing driving itself down the roadway. Odds are you're going to have patients in both vehicles. Um, you know, Same is true like if you get called to a bus accident. There may only be the bus driver on there, um, but the assumption that you should make is there's probably more than one patient. It's better to get extra resources coming and to cancel them than it is to get on scene and realize, oh man, it took me 10 minutes to get on scene. Now I need 5 ambulances and the closest one is 20 minutes away. Well, if it took you 10 minutes to get on scene, that means all those ambulances would have been 10 minutes away when you got there. So common sense just goes a long way. Always err on the side of caution. It's always better to call them and call them off. Most services that you work for are going to have some sort of action plan for these types of situations. Illinois has what's called the MABUS alarm system. So it's all pre-designated. If I call a third alarm, I'm getting 5 ambulances or whatever your cards are set up to be. Utilize the resources you have. use common sense, err on the side of the patient, err on the side of what's going to be best for the scene. So that's the first chapter of the patient assessment, and it's all basically just the scene size up. It's basically what's going to occur when you're coming to the scene and right when you get to the scene. That's all that scene size up is. Now the next section that we'll move into will be kind of that next systematic approach through the assessment process. And like I said, take a lot of stock in these 5 or so chapters, whatever it is, because as you move forward through the class, the assessment's the same for a cardiac patient as it is for a respiratory patient, as it is for a diabetic patient, as it is for a fall patient, as it is for a car accident patient. The assessment process is very systematic. It's going to be the same, and then based on the information that you plug in is going to change the course of action moving forward. So really hit these assessment chapters hard and get a very good understanding to them. Go through the rest of the chapter review here. As I always say, understand if that's important enough to put in the chapter review, it's important enough to put on a test. So keep that in mind. Once we get through this assessment segment, things will slow down a little bit where we'll be back to just 1 or 2 chapters because we'll be into the medical and trauma type situations. So you're really kind of entering the worst section of the learning process as far as information being thrown at you, and then things will kind of start going downhill from here.